Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a reason the Imperium of man calls them the Great Devourer, not just because of the scale of their hunger, not just because of the billions of bioengineered creatures that pour from their hive ships like a tide that has no shore. No, the name carries something deeper than that, something that sits in the gut of every person who has ever read an astropathic relay from a world on the edge of the eastern fringes, where the last transmission before the silence is just a scream. One long, unbroken scream, and then nothing. The Great Devourer, a name that implies inevitability, a force that doesn't hate, doesn't covet, doesn't negotiate, something that simply consumes, and then moves on to consume again. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, there are threats that want to corrupt you. There are threats that want to enslave you. There are threats that want to watch you suffer. But the Tyranids don't want any of those things. They don't have wants in any sense a human mind can recognize. They just eat. They eat worlds, and they eat galaxies, and everything in between. And when it is all gone, they move toward the next light in the darkness and begin again. That is the horror of them, really. Not the carnifex charging through a breach in a fortress wall, all 4 tons of chitin and hunger. Not the genestealer slipping through an air vent aboard a void station, its pale fingers finding purchase in the dark. Not even the hive tyrant, standing 12 feet tall on the corpse of a city, its synaptic command spreading like a slow, cold tide through the minds of everything beneath it. The horror is the emptiness behind all of that. As the complete and utter absence of anything you could appeal to, there is no soul to bargain with, no heart to stir with pity, no ambition to redirect or exploit. The hive mind looks at your civilization, your history, your art, your dead, your living, your children, and sees only calories. And yet, even in this darkness, even in this seemingly bottomless well of certainty and biological inevitability, there are things that give the hive mind pause. Not fear, perhaps, in the way a human soldier feels fear, legs going weak and hands going slick with sweat in the cold dark before a charge. The hive mind does not experience dread in any recognizable sense, but it responds to threat assessments with something that functions very much like fear. It reroutes, it avoids, it redirects entire hive fleets around certain systems, burning the precious fuel of billions of organisms to go the long way around something it has calculated is too costly to engage. And in doing that, in making those quiet, terrible calculations in the dark between the stars, it reveals itself. It reveals its limits. It reveals the things that, deep within whatever passes for its logic, it has identified as genuine dangers. And those things are fascinating, because the Tyranids are not invincible. They are close to it. They are the closest thing to an unstoppable force this galaxy has ever produced. But close to invincible is not invincible. And the places where the armor cracks, the places where even a mind of billions of souls feels the cold finger of something like self-preservation, those are the things we are going to talk about today. This is going to take a while. And that is exactly what it deserves. So get comfortable, settle in, let the dark settle around you like a cloak, and let's go through the whole story from the beginning. Because before we can understand what the Tyranids fear, we have to understand what they are. We have to understand how something like this comes into being, how it crosses the void between galaxies, how it draws a bead on the Milky Way from millions of light years away and begins its slow, implacable approach. We have to understand the architecture of the swarm, the way the hive mind holds billions of creatures together in one coherent, terrible will. And we have to understand what it has already survived, what has already been thrown at it, and what has and hasn't worked. Only then does the picture of what they truly fear become clear. And I think, also, when you see it clearly, it is going to surprise you. The answer isn't a weapon or a prayer, or a particular species of warrior. It is something much stranger than that, something much more fundamental. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let's start at the beginning. Let's start in the intergalactic void, in the cold and empty dark between the Milky Way and whatever lies beyond it, where something vast and ancient, and endlessly hungry, first turned its eyes toward the light. The story of the Tyranids' arrival in the Milky Way galaxy begins with an accident of history that, in retrospect, is one of the most consequential events in the entire 40K timeline. During the Horus Heresy, the most catastrophic civil war the Imperium ever endured, a device on the world of Sotha called the Pharaohs was activated. The Pharaohs was an elder artifact of immense and poorly understood capability, a psychic lighthouse capable of projecting a signal through the warp over distances that boggle the mind. When it was overloaded during the events of that war, it sent a pulse of psychic light outward through the Imperium that crossed distances we struggle to conceptualize with human language. Millions of light years, out past the edge of the galaxy, out across the intergalactic void, out into regions of space that no creature from the Milky Way had ever reached or even clearly perceived. And something in that void, vast and drifting, in a state of patient dormancy, heard it. The Tyranid hive fleets had been traveling through the void between galaxies, slumbering in the way deep space organisms sleep when there is nothing to eat, and conserving energy and waiting with the patience of something that does not experience boredom, because it does not experience individual time. When the Pharaoh's pulse reached them, sensor organisms awakened, processed the signal, and brought more of the collective to awareness. The pulse carried information, psychic information, the kind that tells a species built around psychic detection and consumption that here, somewhere in this direction, at some calculable distance, there is a galaxy absolutely full of living things. A galaxy where billions of species and trillions of individuals are generating an enormous, warm, bright signal of psychic activity, like a bonfire seen from across a vast, dark plain. A meal, the biggest meal in the void for as far as anything the Tyranids had ever encountered could perceive. The hive fleets changed course, slowly, because changing the trajectory of something the size of a hive fleet takes the kind of gravitational energy that we do not have polite units for, but with absolute certainty and absolute commitment. They were coming. They had been coming since approximately the 31st millennium, when the heresy burned and the Pharos blazed and the signal went out. And they arrived, in the terms of a species that does not count time in anything like human lifespans, almost exactly when the math said they would. The first human contact, the formal, documented, here is what we actually know, beginning of the Tyrannic Wars, was in 745 MSU 41 on a world called Tyran Primus. An Adeptus Mechanicus research station, nothing special, a modest outpost on the eastern fringe of the galaxy, was the kind of place that gets its mail late and its supply ships later, and whose personnel are the sort of people who don't mind being very far from everything. By the time any look, Tyran Primus was not a world anymore. It was a bare rock, not bombed, not burned, not the victim of any kind of weapons fire, just empty, stripped of everything biological, down to the last microbe in the deepest soil layer, sucked clean by the capillary towers and hauled up to the hive ships waiting in orbit. Magos Varnak, the commander of the facility, had time to record a data codex before the end. He hid it 3,000 meters below the base, deep enough that the Tyranid dissolution processes did not reach it. And when Inquisitor Fidus Kryptman arrived to investigate what had happened to Tyran, that data codex was waiting. It told him everything. The nature of the invaders, the scale of the fleet, the way they moved, the way they ate, the silence that fell before they arrived. Kryptman named them Tyranids, after the world they had first consumed in Imperial records, and he took his findings straight to Marneus Calgar. What followed, the Battle of Macragge and the First Tyrannic War, is one of the great defensive epics of the Warhammer 40,000 setting, and it is the first time the Imperium genuinely tested the Tyranids and discovered, partly by accident and partly through extraordinary sacrifice, where some of the vulnerabilities actually were. The knowledge purchased at Macragge, at the cost of the Ultramarines' entire first company, among many other losses, forms the foundation of everything the Imperium has learned about fighting the Tyranids since. But all of that is prologue to the real question. Let's get to the meat of it. Appropriate word, given the subject. Part 1. The anatomy of invincibility. Why the galaxy trembles. To understand what the Tyranids fear, you first have to sit with the sheer scale of what they represent. Because when most people think about threats in the Warhammer 40,000 setting, they think about scale in terms of armies or fleets, or the kinds of strategic problems that get solved by dropping a sufficient number of space marines on a problem until it stops moving. The Tyranids do not work like that. Understanding them requires a different kind of thinking, a different kind of scale. The Tyranids are not an army. They are not even a civilization, in any sense that word normally carries. They are, in the most literal possible reading of the phrase, as a living ecosystem that has evolved for the singular purpose of crossing the void between galaxies and consuming everything it finds. Every organism in the swarm, from the tiny ripper that scrambles across a battlefield ingesting everything it can fit in its dissolving maw, to the hive ship that drifts in high orbit above a doomed world and measures hundreds of kilometers from one end to the other, is a single cell in a body that has no clear boundary. That body is the hive mind. And the hive mind is not just big, it is not just powerful, it is a new category of thing entirely. And that is what makes it so difficult to fight and so difficult to truly understand. Consider the biology of a Tyranid invasion for a moment, not the dramatic part, but the part you'd see in a battle report or a piece of concept art showing a Carnifex crashing through a wall. Consider what happens before that. Consider what happens months or sometimes years before the first bioship reaches the edge of a target solar system. It starts with vanguard organisms, genestealers mostly, these lean and terrifyingly agile creatures, all grasping limbs and silent purpose, are seeded across potential target worlds, sometimes generations before the main fleet arrives. They move in the dark, they infiltrate, they spread their genetic material through a horrifying process that gradually converts a portion of the local population into hybrids who feel a compulsive, almost religious loyalty to something they have never seen and cannot name. These hybrids form cults, and those cults work quietly, patiently, over decades, or to weaken a world's defenses from within. When the time comes, they rise. Cities fall into civil war, supply lines get cut, defense forces find themselves fighting their own neighbors in the streets, while the sky above them begins to fill with a darkness that isn't clouds. Then the shadow in the warp falls. Astropaths across the system suddenly lose their connection to the broader network of Imperial communication. Navigators begin to bleed from their eyes when they try to touch the Imperium. The system becomes, effectively, isolated. Whatever is about to happen here, the rest of the galaxy is not going to hear about it in time to help. The prey world is alone, and the first shapes of the hive fleet are already crossing the outer edge of the system in their hundreds and thousands. Massive organic vessels that breathe and pulse and exude a cloud of spores, and smaller organisms that begin raining down before the ground forces have even had a chance to process that this is real. Then the sky opens. Mycetic spores burst from the undersides of the bioships and plummet through the atmosphere in their thousands, and each one carries a cargo of living weapons. Not troops exactly, not soldiers in any sense you could relate to. Organisms, bioforms, creatures designed with exquisite precision by a mind that has had millions of years of practice in making killing things, and they hit the ground running in the most literal possible sense. Hormigants that cover ground at speeds that seem almost comical on footage, until you realize there are 3,000 of them and they are not stopping. There's termagants with organic firearms that are literally part of their biology, the weapon fused to the creature, each round a thing of living material that burrows and dissolves. Tyranid warriors towering over the lesser swarm, their synaptic presence binding the smaller creatures into coherent, coordinated units the way a nervous system binds muscle fibers into purposeful movement. And behind all of that, The big things. The carnifex. 4 tons of hardened chitin and muscle and claws that can rend adamantium. A creature that has no concept of stopping, that does not feel pain in any way that registers as a deterrent, that will continue advancing through wounds that would kill 10 men until it has physically come apart. The Trigon, bursting from the ground beneath fortified positions in a spray of earth and masonry, was a serpentine nightmare 60 tons of coiled lethality, able to tear through a Lehman Russ main battle tank with its forelimbs the way you might tear a piece of bread. And above all of it, the hive tyrant, the living avatar of the hive mind itself, a creature of such terrifying synaptic power that its mere presence in an area enhances the performance of every organism around it, binding them tighter to the will, making the swarm move like a single thought rather than a collection of separate animals. And these are just the named things, the well-documented ones. The hive mind has been doing this to planets for a very long time, and it has encountered an almost inconceivable variety of resistance. It has catalogued the genetic material of every species it has ever consumed, and it draws on all of that material when it builds new bioforms. Some of the creatures you encounter in a Tyranid swarm are not random, they are tailored. The zoanthrope, a creature of almost pure psychic power, encased in a reinforced organic shell, is believed to have incorporated genetic material from the Eldar, the most psychically gifted species the Tyranids have encountered. The biovore, a hunched creature that lobs living spore mines over defensive lines, appears to carry orc-derived genetic material in certain configurations. The swarm learns, incorporates, and builds better weapons from the bodies of those it has already defeated. That is the deepest layer of the horror. It is not just that the Tyranids are hard to kill, it is that killing them teaches them how to be harder to kill. Every army that fights the swarm and inflicts sufficient casualties on it is, in a very real sense, training the swarm for the next fight. The hive mind records everything, the strengths and weaknesses of every type of armor it encounters, the effective ranges of every weapon, the tactical doctrines of every military force it has engaged, and the next generation of creatures it spawns reflects that knowledge, not as a conscious, deliberate process the way a human general might sit down after a battle and update his tactical doctrine, but as an emergent property of something operating on a biological and psychic level, something so much larger than any individual battle that the individual battle is merely a data point, one data point among trillions, in a mind that has been gathering them for longer than most of the species in this galaxy have existed. That is what you are up against when you fight the Tyranids. And yet, here we are. We're talking about what they fear, because they do have limits, they do have vulnerabilities, and those vulnerabilities are baked into the very architecture of what makes them so powerful. The greatest strengths of a thing are almost always also the places where it can be hurt. That is one of the truths that runs through the lore of 40,000 again and again, in species after species, faction after faction, and the Tyranids are no exception. Their unity is their power, their adaptation is their edge, their hunger is their drive. But unity can be shattered, adaptation can be overwhelmed, and hunger can be turned against something that can never be satisfied. The question is how. Part 2. The hive mind, the strength that hides a wound. Let's talk about the hive mind, because it is the center of everything. As it is the thing that makes the Tyranids more than just a very large collection of dangerous animals. It is the thing that coordinates a fleet of millions of bioships attacking from multiple vectors simultaneously. It is the thing that directs 10 billion ground creatures across an entire planet's surface, as though they were the fingers of a single hand. It is the thing that remembers the taste of 1,000 worlds and draws genetic lessons from each one. It is, in the truest possible sense, what the Tyranids are. And it is also, in ways that take time to fully appreciate, a vulnerability. The hive mind is a psychic gestalt entity. It is formed from the combined psychic presence of every Tyranid organism that exists. See, from the largest hive ship to the smallest microbe working to dissolve a fallen building into biomass that can be sucked up through the capillary towers. and return to the fleet. Every single one of those organisms contributes something to the collective consciousness, and together they form something that is bigger and stranger than any of them individually. It is not a hive in the way a beehive is a hive, where there is a queen giving orders and workers following instructions. It is more like a weather system than a chain of command, a massive, distributed intelligence without a center, running its operations through countless overlapping nodes. This is its genius, and this is also its first pressure point. Because while the hive mind itself has no single center that can be targeted, as it still has to pass its will to the creatures on the ground through something, it cannot directly control a hormigaunt scrabbling through the rubble of a collapsed manufactorum the same way a human brain directly controls a finger. The distances are too great, the number of creatures too vast. It has to work through intermediaries, and those intermediaries are the synapse creatures. Synapse creatures are the mid-level tier of the Tyranid hierarchy, the bioforms with sufficiently advanced neurological architecture to act as psychic relay nodes. A Tyranid warrior towers over the smaller swarm creatures and does not merely participate in battle alongside them. It broadcasts the hive mind's will in a radius around itself, binding every lesser creature within that radius into coherent, purposeful action. As the hive tyrant does the same on a dramatically larger scale, its synaptic field extending over a much wider area, coordinating not just individual creatures, but entire wings of the swarm. Without these creatures' presence, the lesser bioforms lose the guiding signal of the hive mind and revert to their base instincts. Some go feral and savage, attacking anything in reach, including other Tyranids. Some simply mill about directionlessly, their threat dropping from organized nightmare to dangerous but manageable wildlife. That word, manageable, is enormously significant in the context of fighting the Tyranids. Nothing about a Tyranid invasion is manageable as a whole, but isolated from the synapse network, individual swarm creatures can be dealt with, and they can be systematically eliminated without the terrifying coordination that makes them so lethal. The swarm, when it loses its synapse coverage, stops being a unified military force and becomes a very large number of dangerous animals that can be hunted rather than fought as a war. This is something the Imperium's military theorists, particularly the Death Watch, have spent considerable time studying and exploiting. When you watch a Death Watch kill team deploy against a Tyranid incursion, you notice very quickly that their priority targeting is not the biggest threat in the immediate sense, not the Carnifex smashing through a wall or the Trigon erupting from the floor. Their priority is the synapse creatures, the Tyranid warrior first, the hive tyrant if it can be reached. Because every synapse creature removed from the battlefield is a node in the network that stops broadcasting, and every node that stops broadcasting leaves a region of the swarm suddenly operating without direction. The Swarm Lord itself, the most powerful synapse entity the hive mind can manifest, is simultaneously the single greatest concentration of tactical command intelligence the swarm can field, and the most consequential target for elimination. When the Swarm Lord falls, entire fronts of a Tyranid assault can collapse into chaos. The hive mind recognizes this and compensates wherever possible, redundantly layering synapse coverage to prevent gaps. But there is always a limit to how many synapse creatures any given engagement can contain, and there is always, somewhere on the line, a weak point where the coverage thins. The Battle of Macragge, the first great confrontation between the Imperium and Hive Fleet Behemoth, made this lesson painfully clear on both sides. The Ultramarines, fighting a desperate defensive action against a swarm that outnumbered them so thoroughly that the mathematics of survival were genuinely indifferent to the outcome, managed to hold long enough for the Imperial Navy's sacrifice to end the campaign only because of the specific effort made to understand the chain of command. Inquisitor Kripman's early intelligence work on the nature of the Tyranid assault at Tyran Primus, preserved in a data codex hidden 3,000 meters below the base's command bunker, before that base was obliterated, it gave the Ultramarines something no other human military had ever had before a major Tyranid engagement: actual foreknowledge of how the swarm communicated, coordinated, and could theoretically be disrupted. But here is the complication that makes the synapse vulnerability only a partial answer. The hive mind is adaptive. When it suffers enough synapse losses in a single engagement to register the pattern, it begins to compensate at the strategic level. It evolves new creatures with synapse capability. It places existing synapse nodes further back from the front lines, using them as command hubs rather than frontline combatants. It distributes its coverage more broadly at the cost of local coordination, accepting a slight reduction in the precision of swarm tactics in exchange for redundancy that prevents catastrophic failure. And it learns that this is a vulnerability, and it does not make the same mistake the same way twice. And this brings us to something that is simultaneously the most terrifying thing about the hive mind and the most revealing. The hive mind learns from defeat. A victory against the Tyranids is never truly a victory in the way a victory against, say, an orc army might be. When an orc army is defeated, it scatters and the individual orcs pursue their own chaotic agendas, and eventually you have a different problem in a different place at a different time. When a Tyranid swarm is defeated, the hive mind absorbs that defeat, processes it, understands exactly what was done to it and how, and incorporates that knowledge into every future engagement. The next hive fleet to face the Ultramarines knows the Battle of Macragge, knows what worked, what failed, where the Imperium's defensive doctrine has holes, knows that the Ultramarines prioritize synapse targeting, plans accordingly. This is why fighting the Tyranids is, in the long run, a losing strategy for any faction that relies purely on military adaptation. Because the Tyranids adapt faster, and they do so on a scale that encompasses every engagement they have ever fought, across countless worlds and thousands of years. You cannot outlearn something that was learning before your species had language. And yet the hive mind has one more structural vulnerability that runs deeper even than the synapse architecture. Something that does not become apparent until you look at what the hive mind is not, as well as what it is. The hive mind has no soul. Now, that might sound like a strange thing to call a vulnerability, but in most contexts you would expect the absence of a soul to be a protection. It is, in certain ways. The hive mind cannot be tempted by chaos, because it does not have the kind of emotional architecture that chaos preys on. It cannot be corrupted, because there is no individual self within it to corrupt. But the absence of a soul also means something else. It means the hive mind has no presence in the Imperium in the way that other psychic entities do. It does not travel the warp. It does not commune with the warp. Its psychic presence, which is vast and terrible and blocks communication across entire star systems, is not a warp presence. It is a material one. And that means that certain threats which operate specifically through the Imperium, certain entities, and certain weapons that are keyed to the nature of warp-connected souls, but do not work on the hive mind the way they work on everything else. It also means, and this is the important part, that the Imperium represents a domain in which the hive mind has genuine limits. The shadow in the warp is not a warp phenomenon. It is the hive mind pressing against the warp from the outside, disrupting it, overwhelming it with the sheer psychic density of billions of linked organisms. But that pressing from outside nature means that entities which operate inside the warp, entities that are native to it and move through it as naturally as a fish moves through water, have a relationship with the Tyranids that is complicated in ways that matter very much. We will come back to that. But first, we need to spend more time with the shadow in the warp itself, because it is simultaneously the Tyranids' most powerful strategic weapon, and in ways that are easy to miss, a thing they themselves have reason to be concerned about. Part 3. The shadow in the warp, weapon, warning, and weakness. The first thing a world knows about a Tyranid invasion is not the sight of bioships appearing on long-range auger arrays, or the screaming of air defense sirens, or even the distant rumble of something descending through the upper atmosphere. The first thing is usually silence, not physical silence. Physical silence is the absence of sound, and there is nothing quiet about the weeks immediately preceding a Tyranid assault. There are riots in the streets as populations feel something wrong without being able to articulate what it is. There are disturbed dreams. Animals behave strangely. Your children weep without explanation. But the silence that matters, the silence that means it is already too late, is the silence of the astropaths. Astropaths are the psychic communicators of the Imperium of man, trained to devastating levels of discomfort in their youth. Their souls burned with a touch of the Emperor's own psychic light during a process called the soul binding. They spend their lives projecting messages across the void through the medium of the Imperium. They are the communication network that holds the Imperium together across its millions of worlds. Without them, there is no coordination, no reinforcement request, no warning sent ahead to the next system in a Tyranid fleet's path. Without them, each world fights and dies alone, and when a Tyranid hive fleet approaches, the astropaths go quiet first, not all at once. And at the very edge of the fleet's psychic reach, the communications become distorted first. Messages arrive fragmented and strange, carrying flashes of wrong imagery. Alien syllables intersperse between Imperial script, something pressing on the connection from outside. Then the communications become unreliable, then intermittent, then they stop entirely. Those astropaths who attempt to push through the interference describe something they cannot properly articulate, something that is not quite sound and not quite pain and not quite madness, but has properties of all three. A billion alien thoughts scratching at the surface of their mind from outside. A pressure that is not exactly psychic and not exactly physical, but feels, in the terminology of those who survive long enough to file a report, like drowning. This is the shadow in the warp. And it is important to understand exactly what it is and what it is not, because both of those things carry implications for what can and cannot threaten the Tyranids. The shadow in the warp is not, as is sometimes assumed, a deliberate strategic deployment. It may not even be something the hive mind actively chooses to project. The most current scholarly consensus within the Ordo Xenos is that it is an emergent property of the hive mind's size and nature. When billions, and then trillions, and then uncountable numbers of organisms are linked together in a single psychic gestalt, and that gestalt moves through real space, the sheer density of that collective psychic presence creates a wash of static in the adjacent layers of the immaterium. The warp, which is in a broad sense a mirror of the emotional and psychic content of the material universe, simply cannot process the presence of the hive mind without distortion. It is like trying to look at something through glass that has been rendered opaque by the density of whatever is on the other side. The practical effects for the Imperium are devastating. Warp travel requires navigators who read the currents of the immaterium like a map, and the shadow disrupts that map, renders it illegible, and makes plotting a course through a region under the influence of the hive fleet somewhere between extremely dangerous and outright impossible. Astropathic communication is effectively ended within the shadow's range. Psychers attempting to use their abilities in its presence find those abilities reduced in power, disrupted, or potentially turned back on them in catastrophic ways. And across the entire affected population of any world under the shadow's reach, there is a creeping psychological erosion, a sense of wrongness and despair that has no identifiable source, but that hollows out the will to resist with patient, terrible efficiency. There are recorded cases of populations on worlds that hadn't yet been physically attacked, worlds still weeks from the first spore descending, where the civil order simply collapsed, not because of anything the Tyranids had done in the physical sense, but because an entire population is now sleeping badly, having shared nightmares in languages they've never heard, feeling an unnameable dread that gets worse with every passing day. The weak break first. Your religious institutions fracture under the strain of prayers that feel like they're going nowhere, of faith that does not provide its usual comfort, because the specific kind of darkness pressing in from outside the warp doesn't have the qualities that human faith was built to resist. Then the opportunistic and the afraid begin making terrible decisions. Martial law, purges of collaborators who are just people who seem more frightened than average. Riots over food that isn't actually scarce yet. By the time the bioships appear, the world's defenders are fighting a population that has already begun to tear itself apart. The Adeptus Mechanicus archives are full of reports from worlds in the path of various hive fleets, where the first casualty reports list not Tyranid attacks, but human-on-human violence. A grim statistic, but an honest one. Yet the shadow is a weapon that turns the prey against themselves. It is, in a very real sense, a siege weapon of the most devastating kind. The Tyranids do not need to fire a shot to begin the degradation of a target world's capacity to resist. By the time the first bioships appear on visual scanners, the psychological and organizational damage is already well underway. The population is already in some degree of breakdown. The military communication network is already compromised. The ability to call for help is already gone. For the majority of the species and factions in the galaxy, this is an almost unsurmountable strategic problem. There is no answer to it that does not require accepting that you are already at a disadvantage before the first creature sets claw on your soil. Yes, there is something deeply ironic about the shadow in the warp that deserves noting before we move on. The Tyranids project this psychic static as a consequence of their own nature, as a function of what they are, rather than what they are trying to do. And yet it has, over the course of the Tyrannic Wars, attracted the attention of something the Tyranids were not specifically trying to engage. The forces of chaos, whose native domain is the very Imperium being disrupted by the shadow, have responded to the Tyranid incursion in ways that are not entirely predictable. Warp storms form and intensify in the wake of major Tyranid campaigns, fed by the psychic energy released when billions of souls are extinguished across consumed worlds. The shadow pushes against the warp from outside, but all that pushing creates pressure differentials. The currents and eddies in the Imperium that can, under certain conditions, produce effects the hive mind did not intend and does not welcome. The formation of the Cicatrix Maledictum, the great rift that split the galaxy in two at the opening of the Era Indomitus, was not caused by the Tyranids, but the centuries of Tyranid campaigns, the wholesale consumption of planetary biospheres, the constant pressure of the shadow in the warp against the fabric of the Imperium were among the many contributing factors to the weakening of the barriers between real space and the warp that eventually made such a catastrophic tearing possible. The Tyranids, in feeding, help create the conditions that are now making much of their food inedible. This is a form of ecological blowback on a galactic scale, and it is one of the things the hive mind cannot simply adapt around, but not for everyone. The shadow in the warp's effectiveness as a weapon is directly proportional to how dependent the target is on the warp, and this is where two of the Tyranids' most significant counters start to emerge, each from a very different direction. The first is the Necrons. The Necrons do not use the warp. They never did, even when they were biological beings. Their technology does not rely on the Imperium in any way. Their soldiers have no souls in the warp-active sense, cannot be targeted through it, cannot be disrupted by interference in it. When the shadow falls over a world held by the Necrons, or over a battlefield where the Necrons are the defending force, the main weapon in the Tyranids' advanced strategic arsenal simply does not work on them. Once it does not slow their response, does not cut their communication, does not panic their soldiers, does not isolate their command structure. The Necrons stand in the shadow the way an iron post stands in a magnetic field, completely indifferent to forces that would shred a more conventional target. The second is more counterintuitive and more ironic. It is chaos. The servants of chaos, who occupy the warp rather than merely using it, who are in some essential sense made of the same substance that the shadow is supposed to disrupt, are in a strange position relative to this weapon. They operate natively in the domain that the shadow is designed to overwhelm. Demons do not require stable warp communication to manifest. They require warp energy. And while the hive mind's presence disturbs the warp, it does not eliminate the energy there. In fact, the disruption caused by the shadow in the warp can, in certain conditions, create a kind of back pressure that makes demonic manifestation near the edges of the effect.
I've spent a lot of time reading through Tyranid lore for this video, and honestly, the thing that stuck with me the most isn't the big tactical stuff. It's the refugee theory, the idea that the Tyranids aren't just hungry, they're running. That somewhere out there in the void beyond the galaxy's edge, there's something so catastrophically dangerous that the most terrifying species in the 40k universe chose to flee from it. I find that genuinely unsettling in a way that most 40k lore doesn't manage to be. Like, you can wrap your head around an army, even a billion strong one, but something that scares the great devourer, that's the kind of thing I lie awake thinking about. But anyways, that's just my take. Let's go back to the video.
Somewhat unpredictable rather than impossible. This is a problem, not because the Tyranids are afraid of demons in the conventional sense, but because demons represent something the Tyranids have a very specific structural problem with, and the shadow does not solve that problem as completely as it solves the problem of every other enemy. But there is something more subtle going on with the shadow in the warp that only becomes apparent when you think about what the Tyranids are trying to do at the galactic scale, and not just in the immediate tactical context of any given invasion. The Tyranids came to this galaxy because of biomass. They want to eat it. All of it. Everything. Every blade of grass. Every ocean. Every atmosphere. Every creature from the mightiest warrior species to the most insignificant soil microbe. They want to reduce the Milky Way to a series of bare, stripped rocks hanging in the dark, and then presumably move on to whatever comes next. That is the long game. And the long game has a problem that the shadow in the warp is making worse. Every world consumed by the swarm releases a burst of psychic energy into the Imperium, as its billions of souls are extinguished. That energy does not go nowhere. It does not simply cease to exist. It flows into the warp, adding to the roiling sea of emotion and consciousness that constitutes that realm. And the more worlds the Tyranids consume, the more they pump into the warp. The more they pump into the warp, the stronger the forces of chaos become. The stronger chaos becomes, the more of the galaxy is consumed by warp storms, demonic incursions, and the general instability that makes regions effectively inedible for the Tyranids. Worlds that have been ravaged by chaos are not merely defended by powerful enemies. They are corrupted, suffused with warp energy, fundamentally changed at a material level by exposure to the Imperium. And chaos-corrupted biomass is, for the Tyranids, entirely without nutritional value. The irony here is profound. The Tyranids, in the process of doing what they came here to do, are actively making more and more of the meal inedible. Every world they devour creates ripple effects in the warp that expand the reach of the forces most capable of denying them further food. The Cicatrix Maledictum, the great rift that tore the galaxy in half during the opening events of the era Indomitus, represents in this context something genuinely alarming to the hive mind's strategic calculus. An enormous and growing region of the galaxy is being rendered permanently off the menu. This is not something the Tyranids can simply adapt around. Adaptation requires biomass. Biomass requires edible worlds, and chaos-corrupted worlds are not edible. The hive mind's answer to this problem is Hive Fleet Kronos. But to understand why Kronos exists, and what it tells us about the Tyranids' strategic fears, we need to first spend time with the chaos problem in detail. As is Part 4, The Warp's Indigestible Children, Chaos as the Tyranids' strategic nightmare, you might expect a chapter about what the Tyranids fear to spend a great deal of time on things that can defeat them in battle, on great champions and legendary weapons, and the most powerful species in the galaxy marshalling their forces for an apocalyptic confrontation. And we will get to some of that. But the thing about the Tyranids is that purely military defeat, while it matters in the immediate and tactical sense, is not the thing that threatens them at a truly existential level. The thing that threatens them at an existential level is the thing that makes their food inedible. And that is chaos. Let's be clear about the nature of the problem. The Tyranids are not afraid of chaos the way you might be afraid of chaos. They don't fear damnation. And they don't fear corruption. They don't dream of the ruinous powers in the way mortal species do. with that constant low-level dread of something reaching for your soul in the dark. The hive mind has no soul in any form chaos can grasp, and the individual organisms of the swarm are so deeply connected to the collective will that they lack the individual psychology that chaos exploits in mortal beings. A termagant cannot be tempted by Slaanesh because it has no desires beyond the hive mind's imperatives. A Carnifex cannot be driven to rage by Khorne because it already is rage, pure and simple and utterly focused, with no room for anything else. So the Tyranids do not fear chaos the way living species do, but they have a very specific, very serious problem with it. Demons are not biomass. That is the crux of it, really. When the Tyranids devour a world, what they are consuming is organic material, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and the complex molecules built from those elements. Amino acids, proteins, lipids, all the building blocks of biological life. That material gets absorbed through the capillary towers, processed on the hive ships, and reconstituted into new organisms or stored as energy reserves for the fleet. It is an enormous, efficient, biological recycling process on a planetary scale. Demons do not have organic material. Demons are, in the most fundamental sense, congealed emotion given temporary physical form through the mechanism of the warp. They are made of something that is not matter in any conventional sense. Something that does not have mass or chemistry or nutritional value in any framework the Tyranid's biology can process. As you cannot eat a demon, you cannot convert the stuff of Khorne's blood legion into chitin and muscle and synaptic tissue. Even if you could destroy every demon on a chaos-infested world, if the world's biosphere had been sufficiently corrupted by warp exposure, what remained would be so thoroughly saturated with Imperium energy that the Tyranids' digestion systems could not process it. It would be like trying to eat light. This creates a strategic problem of the First Order. The galaxy is large, but the Tyranids need all of it. They cannot simply work around the chaos-corrupted regions and accept a reduced harvest. The hive mind's resource calculations are based on the expectation of consuming the entire galaxy's biomass, and any significant portion being rendered inedible throws that calculation into deficit. And as the Great Rift grows, as the Psychotrix Maledictum extends its influence and more worlds fall under the corrupting influence of the Imperium, the inedible fraction gets larger, the math gets worse. The hive mind's response to this problem, as with most problems, was to evolve a new tool. Hive Fleet Kronos emerged from the consolidation of multiple splinter fleets, most of them remnants of Leviathan's survivors after the catastrophic losses at Bel and the chaos following the Great Rift's opening. It is not the largest or the most militarily powerful hive fleet in the galaxy, but it is specifically, precisely, and with remarkable elegance, designed to address the chaos problem, where other hive fleets project the shadow in the warp as a byproduct of their collective psychic presence. But Kronos projects it deliberately and at extraordinary power. The shadow that precedes Kronos is so dense, so suffocating, that it does not merely disrupt warp travel and communication in the affected systems. It actively interferes with daemonic manifestation itself. Demons require a certain minimum level of warp energy in a given region to maintain their physical forms in real space. The shadow in the warp reduces that available energy. For lesser demons, this means they cannot maintain cohesion and are forced back into the immaterium. For greater demons, it means they operate at reduced capacity, fighting the constant pull of an environment that is trying to dissolve them. And in the most extreme application of this power, at the epicenter of a Kronos deployment, the shadow has been documented to actually close active warp rifts. As the wounds in reality seal themselves, not healed exactly, but forced shut by the sheer weight of the hive mind's psychic presence pressing against the other side. The documented case of Shadowbrink illustrates this beautifully. Hive Fleet Leviathan had previously swept through the Shadowbrink system and eliminated a major demonic force there. Afterwards, as the Great Rift's influence expanded, Shadowbrink became a focus of renewed chaos activity, with the warp wound there reopening and demonic legions pouring through. Hive Fleet Kronos responded to this, dispatching invasion tendrils not primarily to consume biomass, because the world was heavily chaos-tainted and largely inedible, but to close the rift. 8 separate Kronos landing forces descended to the planet's surface, or each centered on a neural node of maliceptors and neurothropes. As those psychic creatures established their network across the planetary surface, the shadow in the warp reached such intensity around them that the warp wounds began to close. Khorne's demonic legions charged the Tyranid positions, expecting the close-quarters engagement they thrive in. Kronos refused to oblige them. No melee, no hand-to-claw fight with entities that were specifically designed for exactly that. Instead, an absolutely devastating ranged engagement, waves of flesh-borer fire, artillery organism barrages, spore minefields, the kind of methodical, grinding attrition that a force built on pure martial fury and personal combat is poorly equipped to withstand. The demons were banished, the rift closed, the biomass would take time to decontaminate. But the Tyranids had, in effect, identified a planet being corrupted and removed it from the corrupted column. This is the hive mind acknowledging a genuine strategic threat and building a dedicated solution, not a tactical adaptation for winning an individual battle, but a fleet-level commitment to a new strategic problem. That level of response, building an entirely new hive fleet dedicated to a single strategic function, is not something the hive mind does for problems it considers manageable through normal means. Kronos exists because chaos represents something the normal swarm cannot easily handle, and the hive mind recognized that. The relationship between Kronos and the other hive fleets is also worth noting because it is unprecedented in Tyranid behavior. Normally, when two hive fleets encounter each other, the result is that the stronger consumes the weaker. The hive mind does not sentiment. It does not maintain alliances between its different manifestations. It simply calculates optimal distribution of resources and implements accordingly. But Kronos does not fight other hive fleets. Other hive fleets have been observed stripping planets of their primary defenders and then departing, leaving the world partially consumed and partially intact, in what appears to be a deliberate feeding opportunity for Kronos to exploit. The main fleets are, in effect, setting the table for Kronos to eat from. This degree of interfleet cooperation is something the Imperium's xenobiologists describe as deeply concerning, not because cooperation in a military enemy is surprising, but because it suggests the hive mind is planning on a strategic timescale, coordinating the activities of distinct fleets toward long-term goals other than immediate consumption. That implies a level of galactic-scale strategic awareness that makes everyone who studies it very uncomfortable. But there is another enemy of the Tyranids that is, in its own way, even more fundamentally problematic, one that cannot be countered by a more powerful shadow in the warp, because the shadow was never effective against it to begin with. One that the Tyranid hive fleets have, on multiple documented occasions, steered around entirely rather than engage. A dead civilization, preserved in metal, with no souls, no biomass, and an ancient grudge. Part 5. The Necrons. The enemy, the great devourer, cannot eat. There is a passage in the 5th edition Tyranid Codex that has inspired more debate, more discussion, and more genuine fascination than almost any other single piece of Tyranid lore. It describes 2 minor tendrils of hive fleet behemoth, making significant course corrections during the opening stages of that fleet's advance into the galaxy, deviating from what should have been their most resource-efficient trajectory, specifically and notably to avoid the system of Solemnis. Solemnis is a Necron tomb world. This seems, at first glance, like a relatively dry tactical note. Military forces redirect to avoid unfavorable engagements all the time, but in the context of everything we know about how the Tyranids operate, it carries enormous weight. Because the Tyranids, under normal circumstances, do not redirect to avoid enemies. They redirect toward food sources. And the tactical challenge of reaching those food sources is the kind of thing the hive mind solves by throwing more organisms at it until the problem is resolved. The idea that the hive mind would look at Solemnace and decide that the cost of engaging with whatever was there outweighed the potential gain of consuming it is not a trivial calculation. The hive mind is not cautious by nature. It is patient and calculating, which is a different thing. And when the most patient and calculating military intelligence in the galaxy decides a target is not worth the trouble, that target is worth thinking about. Why are the Necrons such a specific problem for the Tyranids? The most immediately obvious answer is the biomass issue. The Necrons are not biological. They are metal constructs. Their original flesh long since replaced by living metal bodies through a process that happened 60 million years ago. The warrior standing on a battlefield holding a Gauss weapon is not alive in any sense. The Tyranid's biology can process. It has no organic material. It cannot be eaten, incorporated, or converted into new Tyranid bioforms. Even if the Tyranids won every single engagement against a Necron force and destroyed every construct on the field, they would come away with nothing to show for the biomass expenditure required to fight that battle. The fight would cost them organisms, and it would return no resources to offset that cost. From a purely metabolic standpoint, engaging the Necrons is not just unprofitable, it is actively harmful. But the metabolic calculation is only part of the story. Because it does not explain why the hive mind would actually worry about Necrons militarily. After all, plenty of things are inedible. Void shields are inedible. Ferrocrete fortification walls are inedible. The Tyranids encounter inedible materials constantly in the course of their invasions and simply accept that cost as a necessary part of consuming the edible things around them. So why not just fight through the Necrons the way you fight through a defended fortress wall, accepting the cost and claiming the prize on the other side? Because the Necrons don't die. That is the essential problem. A space marine can be killed by a Tyranid. An orc can be killed by a Tyranid. An elder warrior can be killed by a Tyranid. And when these things are killed, the biomass they represent becomes available for consumption. And the tactical situation improves by precisely the degree that force has been reduced. Kill enough of them and you win. The calculation is straightforward. A Necron warrior cannot be killed by a Tyranid in the same sense. It can be destroyed, in the temporary sense of having its metallic body rendered non-functional in the immediate engagement. But the living metal of its body begins to repair itself even as the battle continues. Damaged components flowing back together, broken weapons reconstructing from the raw material of the living metal itself. In severe cases, a Necron warrior that has been literally torn in half will simply drag itself back together on the battlefield, its upper body pulling itself toward its lower body across the rubble. And in less severe cases, Necrons have the ability to phase out, to dissolve their physical presence and teleport their consciousnesses back to the tomb below, where their bodies are reconstructed and prepared for redeployment. You cannot stack up Necron casualties the way you can stack up casualties in virtually any other engagement. The attrition model, that is one of the Tyranids' fundamental strategic strengths, breaks down when the enemy keeps coming back. This is something the Tyranids' predatory logic simply cannot handle gracefully. The entire Tyranid approach to warfare is built on a form of brutal mathematics. Send organisms until you run out of resistance. The math always works because the swarm can always send more organisms than the defender has defenders. You consume the defenders in battle. You absorb their biomass. You use those resources to make more organisms. And you keep going. As it is a closed loop that works against every species the Tyranids have ever encountered, because every species the Tyranids have ever encountered eventually runs out of warm bodies to throw at the problem. But the Necrons do not run out of bodies. Their bodies repair themselves. And the Necrons themselves, beneath the surface of their tomb worlds, exist in numbers that have not yet been fully assessed. The 5th edition codex suggested that the number of Necron tomb worlds in the galaxy represents only a fraction of those that have already awakened, with the majority still dormant. If the full extent of the Necron civilization ever returns to active service, the numbers problem that usually ends every enemy engagement with the Tyranids winning simply by outlasting the opposition, becomes much murkier. It is beyond the individual soldier's resilience. The Necron technological arsenal presents specific challenges for the bioforms the Tyranids rely on. Gauss weaponry operates by disassembling matter at the atomic level. It does not blast or burn its target. It strips it apart, atom by atom, from the surface inward. For a biological organism, even an extremely resilient one, the experience of being hit by Gauss fire is quite different from being hit by a bolter round or a plasma blast or a flamer. Those conventional weapons damage biological structures in ways that biological structures can be engineered to resist. The chitinous carapace of a Tyranid is extraordinarily good at dissipating the kinetic energy of impacts, resisting heat, and managing the shock of explosions. But the atom-level disassembly of Gauss weaponry bypasses all of that. Once it does not interact with the carapace in a way the carapace can be engineered to resist. You cannot grow a thicker layer of something if the weapon operates below the scale at which thickness matters. Consider what this means for the hive mind's adaptation process. The hive mind's ability to develop defenses against a weapon type depends on the weapon type interacting with biological material in a way that can be catalogued and countered. Biological systems can be made more resistant to fire by developing fire-resistant proteins, insulating fat layers, heat-tolerant circulatory systems. They can be made more resistant to kinetic impact by developing harder carapace, more resilient connective tissue, redundant organ systems, which they can even be made more resistant to certain psychic attacks by developing neural architecture that does not respond to the specific frequencies being targeted. But Gauss, atomic disassembly. The hive mind has encountered this technology apparently a limited number of times, because the Necrons have been mostly dormant for 60 million years, and the adaptations it has developed are, by Tyranid standards, incomplete. This is not a weapon type the genetic archive has deep experience with, and incomplete defenses against weapons that work at the atomic level tend to result in significant losses before the adaptation process can catch up. The Necron-heavy weapons, the particle whips of the Doomsday Ark, the death rays of the monolith, the reality-warping projectors of certain Lord-level constructs, which operate at power levels that even the most formidable Tyranid bioforms have reason to treat with caution. A monolith is not merely a vehicle. It is a portal anchor, a gravity weapon platform, and a walking fortress all in one construct. And it is essentially invulnerable to the biological weapons and organic projectiles that constitute the Tyranids' primary armament. You can hurt a Carnifex with enough termagant fleshborer fire if you're willing to spend the organisms. A monolith simply doesn't care about fleshborers. There is an additional wrinkle to the Necron-Tyranid dynamic that doesn't get discussed as often as it should. The Necrons, under the guidance of the Silent King, have a strategic motivation for opposing the Tyranids that goes beyond simple self-preservation. Sarek's plan, insofar as it has been articulated in the lore, and involves the eventual restoration of the Necron people to organic forms. The long sleep in metal bodies was always intended as a temporary measure, a solution to the Satan's bargain that Sarek hoped would eventually be undone. Biological material, living species, are necessary for this goal in ways that are not fully spelled out, but clearly indicate that a galaxy stripped bare of organic life by the Tyranids is a galaxy in which the Necron's most important long-term objective becomes impossible. This gives Sarek a personal investment in stopping the Tyranids that is not purely about military self-preservation. He does not merely want the Necrons to survive. He wants the galaxy to survive in a form that allows what he sacrificed 60 million years of flesh and feeling to one day recover. And for that, the Tyranids must be stopped. Was not slowed, not managed. Stopped. Whether he has a viable plan for achieving this, and what it looks like, is one of the more tantalizing open questions in the current state of 40,000 lore. But the Silent King's return to active engagement with galactic affairs, his willingness to cooperate with species he would normally consider beneath contempt, including forming the remarkable battlefield partnership that produced the Pandorax conflict and other documented joint operations with Imperial forces, suggests he is working towards something. Something that requires an intact galaxy and time that the Tyranids are consuming with every passing campaign season. And Part 6, The Empty Plate. Starvation as the galaxy's best weapon. The thing about fighting the Tyranids is that every conventional strategy for winning a war eventually runs into the same problem. Winning battles is not winning the war. Destroying a hive fleet's ground forces is not destroying the hive fleet. And destroying a hive fleet is not stopping the hive mind. Because the hive mind is not the hive fleet. It is all the hive fleets and all the organisms in all of them, and all the data accumulated from every engagement ever fought, and the experience of consuming an unknown number of other galaxies before it arrived here, and something vast and cold and patient and absolutely committed to what it is doing that exists beyond any specific military formation you could point to and say, there, destroy that, and the war is over. As the war is never over, not in conventional terms. But there is one thing that the hive mind absolutely cannot work around, cannot adapt to, cannot solve with new bioforms or new strategies or any amount of intelligence gathered from defeated enemies. And that is the fundamental metabolic reality that lies at the heart of everything the Tyranids do. They need to eat, not metaphorically, not in a strategic sense that can be reinterpreted or worked around. They need biomass to survive, to grow, to replace losses, to build new organisms, to fuel the hive ships, to maintain the biological infrastructure of the fleet. A Tyranid hive fleet that cannot find food does not sit in space and wait. It does not hibernate. It exhausts its reserves and then it starts to die. The fleet grows weaker. The organisms become smaller and less capable. As the hive ships themselves begin to cannibalize their own substance to maintain core functions, and if the food does not come, eventually the fleet dies. This is the insight that Inquisitor Kryptman developed, after decades of studying the Tyranids, into the most radical strategic doctrine ever proposed within the Imperium of man. Deny the food, not just in the tactical sense of defending worlds and destroying ground forces, in the literal, physical sense of making the food not there when the Tyranids arrive to eat it. The most famous manifestation of this doctrine was Kryptman's cordon sanitaire. Facing the advance of Hive Fleet Leviathan, the largest and most dangerous hive fleet yet encountered, and recognizing that the Imperium could not stop it in direct military confrontation, Kryptman proposed and implemented the most devastating act of deliberate planetary destruction in Imperial history since the Horus Heresy. He ordered exterminatus on every world in Leviathan's projected path, a band of worlds stretching across the Hive Fleet's line of advance, with the explicit intention of creating a gap in the food supply that would starve the fleet into weakness before it could reach more heavily defended and strategically vital systems. The scale of this was breathtaking in its brutality. Dozens of populated worlds, billions of Imperial citizens, all killed in advance of the Tyranid arrival, not because they were already dead, not because they had been occupied, but specifically to prevent their biomass from feeding the swarm. The cyclone torpedoes and virus bombs fell on living worlds, full of people going about their lives, and turned them into dead rocks in the space of hours. Kryptman was exiled from the Inquisition for it. He was branded a mass murderer and a radical. He was hunted by his own colleagues. He was also right. The cordon worked. Leviathan's advance slowed dramatically. The Hive Fleet, expecting to absorb the biological wealth of those worlds and use it to expand its forces for the push deeper into Imperial space, found empty rocks instead. The biomass expenditure for the campaign to date had not been recouped. The fleet weakened. And that weakness bought time. Time for Battle Fleet Tempestus to muster. Time for Space Marine chapters to be redirected. Time for the coordinated resistance to form that, eventually, and managed to hold Leviathan to something less than the total catastrophe it would otherwise have been. The lesson is deeply uncomfortable, but it is real. The most effective thing the galaxy can do against the Tyranids is take away their food. And the most extreme version of taking away their food, the scorched earth denial of biomass at the planetary scale, is something the Tyranids have no tactical answer to. They cannot shoot the exterminatus weapon out of the sky. They cannot evolve a bioform capable of extracting nutrition from sterilized rock. They cannot adapt to the absence of something. Absence has no weakness to probe, no defense to outflank, no immune system to overcome. But Kryptman's cordon was not the only biomass denial strategy that has been employed, nor was it the only one that worked. The other famous example is the Octarius Gambit, and it is arguably even more interesting, if considerably more chaotic in its outcomes. The Orc Empire of Octarius was, at the time Kryptman conceived his gambit, one of the most densely populated Orc regions in the galaxy. Billions upon billions of Orcs, their biomass considerable, their capacity for violence essentially unlimited. Kryptman reasoned that if he could redirect a tendril of Hive Fleet Leviathan into the Octarius system, the result would be a conflict between two of the most prolifically deadly forces in the galaxy, with both consuming resources, fighting each other that neither could afford to spend on expanding into Imperial space. Getting Genestealers to Octarius, allowing them to infest the Orc population, but using the resulting psychic beacon to draw the Hive fleet to the system, and then sitting back to watch the largest and most violent scrap in the sector's history. It was the kind of plan that only someone who has spent their entire adult life thinking about nothing except how to kill Tyranids could conceive of. And it worked. For a while. The Orcs and the Tyranids hit each other like two storm fronts colliding, and the result was a war of mutual attrition that dragged on for years. The hive mind began adapting to Orc biology, spawning new bioforms that reflected the genetic catalogue of everything it had consumed. The Orcs, as Orcs always do, got louder and more violent in proportion to the quality of the fight. Eventually, the Tyranids won. Leviathan consumed Octarius, absorbed the biomass of countless Orcs, and incorporated whatever genetic innovations seemed useful from that confrontation. Kryptman's gambit had been successful in the sense of buying time and expending Tyranid resources, but it was ultimately a delaying action rather than a solution. The Orcs that had been pushed out of Octarius now flooded into Imperial space with nothing to fight but humans, which is always a problem. The Octarius War also produced something unexpected and somewhat concerning for anyone studying the Tyranid threat. The version of Leviathan that emerged from Octarius was notably different from what had gone in. New bioform variants, new tactical patterns, a swarm that had been fighting one of the most adaptively robust military forces in the galaxy for years, and had emerged with its strategic flexibility enhanced. The hive mind had, in effect, used the Octarius War as a training exercise, and what graduated from that exercise was stronger. This is the fundamental catch to all biomass denial strategies. They work. They genuinely work, but they are inherently temporary. They slow the Tyranids. They do not stop them. And the hive mind, patient as deep space, simply waits for the opportunity to eat something else and recovers. What would actually stop the Tyranids? Part 7. Permanent wounds. What can actually hurt the hive mind at scale? We have established at this point a fairly comprehensive picture of what the Tyranids find difficult. Synapse disruption weakens the swarm's coordination without defeating it. Necron resilience and lethality makes engagement tactically costly. Chaos corruption makes food inedible. Biomass denial starves the fleet temporarily. As all of these things are real and meaningful, none of them are sufficient on their own. What would it take to actually inflict permanent damage on the Tyranids? Not a temporary setback, but a genuine, lasting wound on the capacity of the hive mind. The answer, based on what the lore tells us, seems to come down to two things: scale of loss and isolation. Scale of loss matters because the hive mind is, at its core, a living thing, and living things have biological limits. When Hive Fleet Behemoth was destroyed at the Battle of Macragge, it was not merely an abstract tactical victory. The organisms that constituted that fleet were gone. The biomass they represented was gone. The genetic memory they carried was not entirely gone, as because the hive mind had already communicated its findings back to the broader collective before the fleet was eliminated. but the specific adaptations, the particular configurations of bioforms that had been developed for that campaign, the resources invested in building and deploying that fleet, all of that was genuinely, permanently lost. And that loss mattered. Behemoth's remnant splinter fleets were dramatically weaker than the main fleet had been. They were scattered and dangerous in the way that any Tyranid organism is dangerous, but they were not a strategic threat in the way the main fleet had been. The hive mind took decades to rebuild anything comparable from the resources available to it in the eastern fringes. The implication is that if you can hurt the Tyranids at sufficient scale, not wound a tendril, but actually eliminate a significant fraction of the biomass and genetic material they have invested in a campaign, you impose a real cost. Not an insurmountable cost, given enough time and access to new food sources, but a real one. The second factor, isolation, is more theoretically promising and more practically difficult to achieve. The hive mind is a distributed network, and its resilience comes from that distribution. But the distribution depends on communication, the psychic link that allows the hive mind to share genetic information and tactical data between its various fleets and tendrils is a real and operating thing, and it has range limitations. A splinter fleet that is cut off from the main network for long enough stops being able to receive updates from the broader hive mind and is limited to what it already knows. It also, eventually, loses coherence. Without the constant reinforcement of the collective will, a truly isolated Tyranid force becomes, over time, less than it was. The challenge is that the distances involved in galactic-scale isolation make this practically difficult for any faction to exploit. You cannot cut off a hive fleet from the hive mind the way you can cut a comm relay. The psychic link operates on a scale that no known weapon system can simply jam. But there are suggestions in the lore that certain extreme Necron technologies, as specifically the kinds of warp dampening and psychic nullification devices that the Silent King has been working to restore and deploy as part of his strategy against the Tyranid threat, might be capable of operating at the scale required to create genuine isolation zones. Whether any faction has the will and the resources to pursue this strategy at sufficient scale is a different question. The Imperium is a fractured, war-torn organization struggling to maintain itself against a dozen simultaneous existential threats. The Necrons are still largely in the process of waking up, their ancient forces not yet at full strength. The Aeldari and their craft worlds have the psychic sophistication to understand what would need to be done, but lack the raw military mass to do it alone. The scenario in which the Tyranids are actually was genuinely contained, not merely slowed, is one that requires the kind of galactic-scale cooperation that the 40,000 setting is specifically designed to make impossible. Different species, ancient enemies, each pursuing their own survival by their own means, in a universe where trust is almost always a prelude to betrayal, which might actually be the most grimdark thing about the Tyranid threat. Not that they are so powerful they cannot be stopped, but that stopping them requires exactly the kind of unified response that the galaxy's history and nature have made essentially impossible. Part 8. The adaptability ceiling. When evolution hits its limits, one of the things that is most often said about the Tyranids, usually in contexts that are meant to be terrifying, is that they can evolve a response to anything, and that the hive mind's ability to analyze threats and produce biological solutions to them is essentially without limit. That if you throw enough at the swarm to kill it once, the next generation simply won't die to that particular thing. This is broadly true, and it is deeply alarming, but it is not entirely true. There are limits to what adaptation can achieve, and understanding those limits tells us something important about what the Tyranids actually fear. Adaptation requires information. The hive mind's ability to develop new bioforms in response to threats depends on having sufficient contact with those threats to understand them. The first wave of an invasion, the leading edge of organisms sent to probe a new defense, typically suffers very high casualties. They die to things the hive mind has not seen before, or weapons and tactics that don't match anything in the genetic archive. Those deaths are data, and the data is processed, and the next wave incorporates adjustments. This process is remarkably fast by biological standards, but it is not instantaneous, and it is not perfect on the first iteration. This means that tactics or weapons that can inflict very high casualties before the swarm has time to adapt them are genuinely threatening in a way that more conventional sustained fire approaches are not. A weapon that kills 10,000 organisms before the hive mind can process what it is and begin developing a response has inflicted real damage. A weapon that kills those 10,000 slowly over weeks of grinding engagement gives the hive mind time to learn as it goes. The Deathwatch's approach encodes this understanding deeply. Yet the Deathwatch is the Inquisition's weapon of choice against the Tyranids for a reason that goes beyond raw capability. A Deathwatch kill team is small enough that the hive mind's attention does not fully engage with it in the way it engages with a massed Imperial Guard regiment. But it is lethal enough to accomplish objectives that require the death of very specific targets in very specific ways. The kill team goes in, identifies the highest value targets in the specific engagement, kills them with extreme efficiency, and exits before the swarm has fully processed what just happened. This is the art of fighting the Tyranids without teaching them. Hit hard, hit fast, take the priority targets, and leave before the feedback loop of Tyranid adaptation has time to run its course. This is also one of the reasons that poison weapons have historically been effective against Tyranid swarms in ways that sustained weapons fire is not. The venom Cryptmen developed from the captured lictor's genetic material, the substance that was used to kill the Norn Queen at Tarsis Ultra, worked specifically because it was novel. It targeted biological processes the hive mind had not encountered this particular attack vector against before. The Tyranid organisms at Tarsis Ultra had no defense against it because there had not been enough time to develop one. Had the same venom been deployed again against the next swarm to threaten an Imperial world, the result might have been very different. The hive mind would have filed the experience, understood the mechanism, and evolved resistance in the intervening generation. So that is simply how it works. But in the moment, novelty is lethal, and novelty used with extreme precision against a critical target is more lethal still. This is why the Deathwatch spends so much of its operational capacity on developing new poisons, new neural disruptors, new psychic interference techniques, new configurations of weapon types the Tyranids have not yet encountered in any given form. Not because one weapon will be the solution to the Tyranid threat, but because the window of effectiveness for any novel weapon is limited, and you want to get as much use out of that window as possible before the hive mind closes it. Adaptation requires information, but adaptation also requires time, and if you can deny the Tyranids time, they cannot adapt to whatever you are doing to them fast enough to survive it. The problem, as always, is scale. On the scale of any individual engagement, denying the Tyranids time means operating with a speed and lethality that allows your kills to outpace their adaptation. That is achievable. It is not comfortable or sustainable, but it is achievable. On the scale of a campaign, sustaining that tempo for weeks or months is vastly more difficult because the hive mind does not stop adapting between engagements. It processes continuously. Every hour, you are not actively killing Tyranids. They are becoming better at killing you. And on the galactic scale, the Tyranids have all the time in the universe. They are patient in a way that makes geological time feel hasty. Whatever novel weapon or novel strategy the Imperium develops, whatever new alliance or new doctrine gets field tested against the swarm, just the hive mind eventually catalogues it and develops a response. Not quickly enough to stop the weapon from working the first time, but fast enough that the second time looks different, and the third time looks different again. And before long, the window has closed and you need something new. This is the adaptation ceiling in practice. Not a ceiling on the hive mind's ability to adapt, but a ceiling on any given faction's ability to produce novel solutions fast enough to stay ahead of the adaptation curve. The Imperium is not, by any honest assessment, winning this race. It is losing it more slowly than a pure military analysis would suggest. because of the courage and sacrifice of its defenders and the occasional strategic insight of people like Kripman. But losing slowly is still losing in the end. Yet if nothing changes at a more fundamental level, there is one other area where adaptation hits limits that is worth discussing, because it connects to something deep in the Tyranids' nature. The hive mind cannot adapt to things that it cannot in some sense experience. The Tyranids have no concept of art, of music, of narrative, of grief, of love in any form that the galaxy's species recognize. These things do not register to the hive mind as relevant inputs. They are not weapons, they cannot be consumed, and they do not affect the operational efficiency of the organisms around them in any measurable sense. And so the hive mind has developed no response to them. This matters in a way that sounds philosophical but has genuine implications. Every species the Tyranids have ever faced has eventually found that the things which matter most to them, in a human sense, the stories they tell, the gods they pray to, the bonds between individuals, the meaning they find in resistance, are not weapons in any sense the hive mind can counter. The last defenders of a world, knowing they are going to die and that the world is going to be stripped bare anyway, sometimes fight with a ferocity that the hive mind's tactical models do not anticipate. Because the models are built on the assumption that fighting organisms will eventually reach a threshold of losses beyond which they retreat or surrender. But sometimes, for reasons the hive mind genuinely cannot process, they don't. Sometimes the last 100 defenders of a polar fortress hold a position that 10,000 could not, because they are fighting for something the hive mind has no category for. The Ultramarines' first company at Makrug is the example that comes to mind most immediately. They fought until they were all dead, not until the situation was hopeless, not until the losses exceeded the tactical value of continuing. Past that point, far past it, into the territory where the only thing keeping them fighting was the thing they had sworn to defend, and the brothers dying beside them, and the knowledge that every second they held was a second bought for the chapter they loved. The hive mind filed those deaths as attrition data. What it could not file, what did not compute, was why. That gap between what the hive mind can process and what actually drives the species it hunts is one of the subtler things that has kept the galaxy alive this long. And it is not a weapon, it cannot be deployed, but it is real and it matters, and it is something the Tyranids cannot adapt to because they cannot understand it well enough to recognize it as a variable. Part 9, what drove them here. The terrifying possibility beyond the rim. We have spent a great deal of time on what the Tyranids find difficult, what they avoid, what they cannot eat, what they cannot adapt to. But there is a possibility buried in the lore that is, in some ways, the most unsettling of all. Not what threatens the Tyranids from within the galaxy, but what may have driven them here from beyond it. The Tyranids are extragalactic. This is established fact. They arrived in the Milky Way from the intergalactic void, from beyond the rim of the galaxy, traveling without the warp, using the gravity manipulation technology of the novel organism to compress space ahead of them and create transit corridors through the material universe. They came from somewhere, and the nature of that somewhere is not documented anywhere in the Ordo Xenos' archives, because everything that might have told us something about where they came from, every world, every civilization, every species, in whatever galaxy or galaxies they passed through before reaching us, is gone, consumed. Left as a bare rock rotating in the dark with no memory of what it once was. The question that has haunted Tyranid scholars since the early studies of Hive Fleet Behemoth is whether the Tyranids came here simply because the Pharaoh's beacon attracted them, had the overloaded psychic signal from the Sotha device that was activated during the Horus heresy and sent a wave of psychic light across millions of light years of void, or whether there is something more to it than that. Whether the Tyranids were already moving toward the galaxy before the Pharaohs lit up, drawn by the general psychic luminosity of a galaxy full of billions of psychic beings, whether they were simply looking for a new meal after consuming everything accessible in their immediate vicinity, or whether they were running from something. The theory that the Tyranids are refugees is not widely held, and it has no direct canonical support. But it has clues, and those clues are interesting. The first is the sheer urgency of the Tyranid advance. Shall Hive Fleet Behemoth attacked with what the lore specifically describes as a berserker directness. No subtlety, no patient probing, a full-speed charge that used more biomass than it could easily replace. This is not the behavior of an organism that is hunting opportunistically. It is the behavior of an organism that needs to eat right now, that cannot afford the time to be patient because something behind it is worse than starvation. Behemoth was reckless in a way the hive mind generally is not. The hive mind is patient by nature. Behemoth was not patient. It burned through resources like something that could not afford to wait. Some scholars within the Ordo Xenos, working from the most restricted and sensitive classification levels, have pointed to an additional data point. The hive fleets approaching the Milky Way are not arriving from a single direction. Behemoth came from the galactic southeast. Kraken came from the east and northeast. Leviathan came from below the galactic plane entirely, attacking in a pincer movement from two widely separated points south of the galaxy's disk. These different approaches suggest different origin points, or at minimum different final approach trajectories from the same origin. If the Tyranids were simply following the Pharaoh's signal, they would presumably be approaching from roughly the same direction, since the signal emanated from a specific point in space. The fact that they are arriving from different directions could mean there are multiple independent hive civilizations out there, each having heard the signal and responded independently. Or it could mean the main body of the invasion is far larger and more broadly distributed than anything we have encountered so far. And the fleets attacking the Milky Way are tendrils extended from something that encircles the entire local group. Neither option is comforting, but the second one is considerably more alarming, and it is the one that the Silent King's behavior seems most consistent with. Zarek saw something out in the void, not just hive fleets, something about the scale of what he observed, the totality of it, the sense of something that extended far beyond the individual fleets he could directly observe, was enough to turn him around and bring him back. He had spent 60 million years in the void. He had seen things no creature from the Milky Way can imagine. And whatever he saw that represented the full Tyranid threat was sufficiently alarming that even he felt the weight of it. If you take the refugee theory seriously, then the Tyranids' deepest fear is not anything in the Milky Way. It is not the Necrons, or the forces of chaos, or the starvation threat of biomass denial. It is whatever is out there in the dark beyond the galactic rim that was enough of a threat to drive the most powerful biological entity ever encountered in this part of the universe, across millions of light years of void, eating everything in sight as it fled. And if that thing is behind them, and if the Tyranids are running from it, then at some point it will arrive here too. The 40,000 setting has the wisdom to leave this question unanswered. An answer would diminish the horror. The horror lives in the uncertainty, in the possibility that the Great Devourer, the thing that devours galaxies and makes humanity feel like prey, is itself something's prey, that the food chain goes higher than we can see, that the darkness between the lights is not just empty, that something lives there, and it is hungry, and the Tyranids are between us and it. This is the thematic note on which 40K's Tyranid lore is most genuinely terrifying. Not the swarms, not the individual creatures with their horrible biology and their single-minded purpose, but the suggestion of scale, that the things we can see and fight and die against are not the end of the horror, that there is more and worse, and it is coming. In the grim darkness of the far future, the Tyranids fear what most makes sense for them to fear. They fear the empty plate, the inedible foe, the food supply denied. They fear the structural vulnerabilities in their synapse network, and they compensate for those vulnerabilities with every tool available to a biology that has never stopped evolving. They fear the spreading corruption of the Imperium, which takes their food away sector by sector. They fear, in a way they cannot articulate because they have no language, the enemy that cannot be eaten and refuses to die. But deepest of all, perhaps, they fear whatever made them run in the first place. Part 10. The Sum of All Fears. what actually keeps the hive mind awake at night. So let's bring this together. After all of that, after walking through the architecture of the swarm and the structure of the hive mind and the shadow in the warp and the Necron problem and the chaos problem and the biomass denial strategies and the limits of adaptation, what is the final answer to the question we started with? What do the Tyranids fear more than anything? The answer is not a single thing. It is a constellation of things, each connected to the others, each illuminating a different facet of what it means to be the largest and most dangerous predator in the galaxy and still have limits. They fear the empty plate. More than anything tactical, more than any specific enemy, the hive mind's deepest strategic concern is the denial of biomass. The Krypton cordon demonstrated this in the most brutal and unambiguous terms. When you remove the food, the Tyranids have no move. They cannot outflank the absence of something. They cannot evolve their way around starvation. The hunger that drives them is also the thing that can be used against them. Because a hungry army cannot eat if there is nothing to eat. They fear the enemy that cannot be eaten. The Necrons are the specific case, but the principle is broader. Any force that is biologically inert, that fights at extreme lethality while providing no nutritional return on the biomass expended to fight it, represents a strategic problem that the hive mind's standard calculus cannot solve. The Necrons compound this by being effectively immortal in the tactical sense, by having technology that targets matter at the atomic level, and by being completely immune to the hive mind's most powerful strategic weapon. This is why the hive fleets reroute around active Necron tomb worlds, not because they cannot fight Necrons, but because fighting Necrons costs more than it gains, and the hive mind, for all its alien nature, understands economics. They fear the warp's corruption of their food supply. Chaos does not threaten the Tyranids militarily in the conventional sense. It threatens them nutritionally. Every world swallowed by a warp storm is a world the Tyranids cannot eat. Every daemonic incursion that corrupts a planetary biosphere removes that biosphere from the consumption ledger. And this problem is growing, not shrinking, in the current era of the 41st millennium. The cicatrix maledictum represents a spreading stain across the galactic food supply, and the hive mind knows it. They fear the synapse vulnerability and what it implies. The reliance on synapse creatures is, ultimately, a structural dependency, and structural dependencies can be exploited. The hive mind compensates for this, adapts its synapse coverage distribution as he evolves new configurations to reduce the vulnerability, but it cannot eliminate it entirely because the synapse network is not an optional feature. It is the thing that makes the swarm more than a collection of animals. Remove it and you have animals. Dangerous animals, but animals. And then there is the deepest fear of all, the one suggested by the Silent King's return, and the possible existence of something in the void that even the hive mind runs from. The fear of something that is to the Tyranids what the Tyranids are to us. Something that looks at the great devourer, with its quintillion organisms, and its billion-year history, and its adaptive genius, and its endless hunger, and sees not a threat to be defeated, but a meal to be consumed. Whether that thing exists in canonical 40K is deliberately unanswered, but it is, in many ways, yet the most terrifyingly honest thing the setting has ever suggested. That we live in a universe where something as terrible as the Tyranids might be the second most frightening thing out there. That the predator at the top of the food chain might itself be prey to something we have not yet encountered. That the darkness between the galaxies might contain things that make the darkness within them look friendly and familiar by comparison. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But somewhere out there, perhaps, beyond the light of the Astronomicon and the reach of any prayer the Emperor's faithful can offer, there may be something that even the Great Devourer cannot eat its way out of. And that is, genuinely, the most haunting idea that Warhammer 40,000 has ever offered us. That is going to do it for today. We went deep, all the way from the biomass economy of a Tyranid invasion to the edge of the known universe, and whatever lies beyond it, and I hope the journey was worth the time. If you want more of this kind of comprehensive, deep dive lore content, the single most meaningful thing you can do is hit that subscribe button right now and leave a comment below telling me what aspect of this topic you found most fascinating, or what you want me to cover next. Every comment, every subscription, every share of this video with another 40,000 fan helps this channel grow and lets me keep making content like this. The community is extraordinary, and being part of it is a genuine privilege. Like the video if you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you haven't already. And until next time, may the Emperor protect, if he still can.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.